Hello, everybody, and welcome to Getting APIs to Work. Today, we say hello to Ronnie Mitra of Publicis Sapient. Hey, Ronnie, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, thank you. How are you?
Well, I'm doing well myself, thank you. Ronnie is joining us because since working for Publicis, he has had a lot of experience with microservices, and today we want to learn more about what happens when you start using microservices. And one thing that you came up with are 5 microservices truths. Just tell us a little bit about how you got to those truths that we will walk through today.
Sure. So it's a very complicated, complex area. So of course, you boil it down into 5 sentences. That makes it look like it's really simple, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It is a complex topic with a lot of facets, but in the end, a lot of people might experience the same things along the way. And it's interesting to listen, I think, to somebody who has had quite a bit of experience and see what happened, and maybe that'll happen to you as well. Okay, let's go through those truths and see what they are. Number 1, microservices are an optimization technique.
Yeah, so what does that mean, right?
Yes.
The truth is, so in my experience of helping people with this, sometimes we lose sight of the fact that we're not talking about building something new. Often we're not even talking about a new business function. It's just, how do you make what you have better, right? That's the key almost always with these microservices things.
And I like the way of putting it as an optimization technique. It really boils down to the fact that it's all about implementation, probably improving the way how you're doing implementation, but it is mostly around that. So what are the biggest things that you encounter when people do not look at that truth of it's just an optimization technique, so to speak, that may happen if you lose sight of that?
Well, there's thousands of decisions here. So when we're talking about microservices and microservices architecture, to be honest, that's your cloud platform, how you manage code, how people work, what the teams look like, how to write the code itself, how big something should be, how small something should be, what category it should be. And it's just an insane level of analysis paralysis at some point, right? So there's kind of 2 ways to go about it. Some people just have a strong opinion, they trust their gut, and they drive forward. Inevitably, what happens is you start getting into all those little decisions, you kind of lose sight of where you were trying to go. So the decisions are not grounded in anything, right? Or the other thing that happens is you spend so much time in the room with the architects, drawing up, the ivory tower version of what things should look like, that you never get anywhere. So I'm really adamant with my clients about, let's start with some goals, some principles, really spend a bit of time early on with it and keep coming back to it. And you need measures also for that feedback loop.
That part, I think, is really important to start with, like, why are we even doing this, and how do we make sure that we are getting those things out of it that we want to get out of it? And as you say, sometimes maybe that's where people are losing sight of that a little bit.
It's amazing to
Let's
see.
Move on.
It's amazing to see, like, the differences in goals and how they impact the work. So maybe you and I, if we're starting something together, we might have a goal of saving costs, like our AWS billing costs, right? That's going to be a different architecture than if our goal is, look, we've got lots of money, but it takes us 2 years to do a software release. Those are 2 very different architectures, right? And that's why it's so important to really figure out, what are you optimizing for?
And that's an interesting point, actually, because I think there was just this article, I think it was just released this week by McKinsey, about open banking and APIs. And it was just interesting to me that still the number 1 thing that banks are looking for in API architecture is cost reduction. And I was surprised by this, but it's still something that is very, very important for a lot of organizations. And sometimes I think that's what we, maybe coming from the API side of things, we don't even have that on our radar so much. We're thinking more about how to do things better in an architectural way, or how to increase the velocity, or these kind of things. Okay, now let's move on to point number 2, to truth number 2, actually, which is microservices work better with APIs. And that confuses me a little bit, because I thought microservices always work with APIs. So please explain that to us.
Yeah, everyone may not know that I've worked with Eric in the past, and I think I've heard you say this before. The interesting thing about how words develop, right, is as this microservice word entered our lexicon, I think the world of practitioners, they've kind of decided microservices is the inside stuff. It's really very implementation-y, right? It's about how we write the code, deliver the code, how we break up something into deliverable pieces. And the APIs, when they refer to them, they're usually talking about something sitting at the edge. Sometimes abstract, sometimes concrete. Sometimes when people say APIs, they mean the things that are at the edge of their company's border. So it's the stuff for third parties. My point is that you have to bring that thinking in, though, right? If you purely take this implementation focus thinking that microservice leads you to, very engineering focused, you never really think about what the interfaces for this should look like. And bigger than that, you don't think about the people who have to use the services, right? So if you remember early days of microservices, we started to see this idea that, yeah, there should be like hundreds of these things. And then you just expose it. And we scratched our heads a bit, said, yeah, but what about the person who has to deal with the hundreds of services? How does that work, right? So bringing that thinking in, that developer-centric, someone has to use this thinking in, is key.
So what you're talking about here then is not so much that on a technical level that API should be there, because they will be, but more like the API mindset, or whatever we call this kind of thing, where it's like it's important to think about your interfaces, how people will consume what you're building, and to design that in a way so that it becomes findable and consumable. So that's more the focus that you're looking at here?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And the way, to be honest, that manifests itself or expresses itself as technology, right? So like a traditional, get, put, post, delete type API structure, I might end up nesting that or layering that. So I have like a big ones on the outside, and then it goes to smaller ones, and then an API that bounds a group of microservices, right? That's a pretty common model. But the point is, I'm thinking about the APIs in that sense and who they serve. And then if you want to get more complicated or more let's say futuristic, you might start bringing in hypermedia interfaces. Maybe that changes the model because it changes how the components talk to each other. But the point is, you're thinking about it. You're thinking about what's the best message-based interface for this? Or if I use gRPC, what does that look like? And how does it feel to have to use these things from a client code perspective that's calling them?
Okay, that's a good point. Just start thinking a little bit, at least outside in, and I think that really is a good point. And this discussion that you were just mentioning, it's like you have to think about it. What kind of technology or approach do you choose? Leads us to truth number 3, which also is a little bit in that area, which is where you say microservices eventually lead to events, which is an even different approach for doing APIs. Why do you think that is?
It's interesting, right? I haven't seen a large-scale microservice transformation that hasn't eventually led to an event-driven architecture. And there's a reason. The reason is, as you sort of break something up into pieces, inevitably you go on the web and you read something that says, oh yeah, microservices should have independent data. Because ultimately, if they all share the same data model or schema, then you get stuck, right? We all have to agree on changing that data structure. So you say, okay, independent data. But as soon as you do that, you run into this problem of, but wait a second, but how there's dependencies with the data. And then how am I dealing with that? Like, how can I break it up in a way that I also break up the data? Often that just leads you down the road of, okay, well, there's tools like Kafka. Well, what's Kafka? Oh, it's this event-driven architecture idea. And you start to see almost like 2 messaging patterns. So we still have this world of, I can request a service to do something. It does it and replies. And then you have this other world of the services all telling each other about things that they've done, so that we can have like either a log or, some way of having eventual consistency. It's hard to pull off, but we get there. The other side of the event world is also in how you model what you have, right? So we've all heard domain-driven design, all these things. Everyone wants it. No one knows what it is, and everyone tries to apply it, right? But one of the ways to simplify it is you start looking at your whole space really as like events that are happening, and you break it up that way. So you just start to see events pervade microservices as you get to about 6 months to 1 year in.
Okay, that is I think a very interesting and also a very impactful observation, because like you say, oftentimes I think these things will develop over time, and the question then is also how quickly are you in kind of adjusting maybe your architectural viewpoint, right? Instead of saying, but we are using REST, so that's all we do, and at some point maybe just saying, yeah, that maybe was useful for a while, but in that new, more decentralized way of how we build things, we also need a new way of how things communicate. How easy do you see that transition happening when organizations do realize maybe this event-driven style actually works better for this new thing we're doing here? Is that something that typically works well, or does it tend to be painful? What are your observations here?
It's a good question. I think it's always painful because it's if you are entrenched in request reply thinking, you're changing your mental model. It's turning your whole idea of how communication should work upside down. It's going from, you know, I want to do something to I have done something. And that takes a moment for people to grasp. But here's the good news. I mean, there's so much good tooling. There's a lot of prescription about how to do this now. Event-driven architecture is a real thing, right? And we're seeing a lot more content material come out. Like everything, right? I know you're laughing because it's always rediscovering something from the 1970s, which is true. But people are doing it now. So there's real production cases. This is real stuff. So there's enough guidance out there that you can get to it. There's just an initial learning curve, I think.
For those organizations who are like dipping their toes into this new event-driven thing, do you see them like going all the way and say, okay, from now on, everything we do is event-driven? Or do you see them embracing that new style and still saying, okay, that's a new thing we do, but we still also do some request response APIs because those work well and those work well for us?
Yeah, for me, the clear trend has been 100%. It's a yes and, right? So yes, we have use cases where a front-end application, a mobile application, needs to be able to query data or needs to execute a command. And for that, we have a traditional request reply mechanism. Or inside, we have an RPC mechanism for service to service. And we have this other event-driven architecture to serve like data synchronization and logging and to be more reactive. That's where we are now. Now, in 5-10 years, maybe the event-driven part takes over. I don't know. But I certainly haven't seen anyone go all in, at least not in my client base.
Yeah. So I think that's a very valuable observation there to see that, okay, it's a mix. The world of APIs is becoming more diverse, which is good. We have more things in our toolbox, but it doesn't mean that you have to throw away everything that you had before and did before. And I think that's also a very good segue into the truth number 4, which is you'll need tools and technology. What do you mean by this?
It's a big statement because really this is like the definition of what we do. If you look at, I made this kind of offhand comment, it's stuff from the 1970s we're rediscovering. You know, part of the reason we're rediscovering how to do structured design, how to do event architecture, is because tools and technology made it cheaper and feasible, right? Like Docker made so much possible. Cloud architecture made so much possible. Kubernetes made so much possible, right? So a big part of an architect's job, if you're trying to optimize and you're trying to build this complicated microservices thing, is how do you take all that complexity and push it down in the stack a bit? So if I'm developing a microservice in your organization, I don't have to think about the 10,000 problems. I just have to solve 100 problems, right? Because the rest is taken care of for me. So that means things like gateways, things like container orchestration, things like service to service, non-functional, resiliency, circuit breaker, all of that stuff, meshes. There's a lot of tools to pick from, but they take away a lot of the complicatedness of doing this.
I'm wondering a little bit here about, like, recently I had a conversation about a Backstage and the popularity of kind of internal developer portals. And a big part of Backstage is not just to be a portal for consumption, but also to provide developers with development environments, right, that they can start from.
Yeah.
And I think that is because developers do have more and more tools and technologies that they can use, but that also need to be made easily usable for them. Is that something that you see happening a lot, that because we do have this growing set of tools and technologies that we use, that you also need to think more about how to package that and hand it to developers, and not just, you know, like give you a big mountain of things and things, like you make sense of that somehow and start building things?
Absolutely. And look, it's a huge relief when I start working with someone on a microservices project and they're willing to talk about people. Because if you're not talking about people, then the thing is doomed, right? So that means understanding how the teams are structured, like the classic Conway's Law idea, but also what the journey is like you described, the developer experience. And here we're not talking about the people outside your company you're building APIs for, but your own people. So tools like, you know, you're talking about Spotify's tool, I think, right?
Yes.
Yeah, tools like that, or just really even just thinking about the experience, like when you're sitting down to design your architecture, if you haven't thought about what it's like for someone to build on your platform, from finding services to writing their own components to deploying them and making that as easy and cheap as possible, then I don't think you're doing the right things.
Yeah, I think in that sense, it all boils down to developer experience a little bit, right? Like, how easy is it for somebody to get their job done without all the tools and technologies that are useful, but without those things like almost like getting in their way, because there's so many to choose from and that it's hard to make sense of them.
And when you dig into it, it's even more than developers. I know we care so much about developers because, I mean, when we started talking about APIs, they were underserved, right? They were just this let the animals out of the cages kind of mentality, right? But in addition to developers, you should be thinking about the operator experience, the DevOps experience, the business experience. You know, how are you serving reports and analytics? Like, really, to succeed, you need to focus on these people, right? And build those journeys in that way. So what is that, like 6 truths now? You're adding a truth.
No. We're still at truth number 4. I still have one left. Right. And I need to remind you here, these are your truths, not mine.
Yeah, fine.
I hope you recognize them. And I think by discussing number 4, we also almost went into number 5, which is the last one, that says microservices are complex. Take small bites. So where does that come from?
Well, we all envy the greenfield people, right? Who get to start something new, and they go out into this greenfield and they build something, and they never have to prove it because it's so early that you just start something, and if it works, you talk about it. If it doesn't, no one ever knows, right? Like, so you just do whatever you like. But most of the people I work with are not working in pure greenfields. They have established businesses that make a ton of money. Like you said, oftentimes the optimization here is reducing costs. It's not that they're building a business from scratch. It's about moving from something that works to something that could work better. That means you're talking about existing people, existing power structures, existing organizational designs, things with momentum. If you're only changing the tech, then maybe you could do a big bang and go after the whole thing, just shake the foundations. But the truth is, with this stuff, you're not just changing the tech. You're changing culture, you're changing ways of working. That means it's very complex. You change one thing, and then there's a side effect over here, or someone's job is at stake when you change this, so they don't want that change. There's resistance to it. So really, you just have to go after this in a common sense way with small pieces. And identifying where to start and how to start is like what we help a lot of our clients with.
And then also gaining experience from these things a little bit, right? Understanding, okay, this went well, this didn't work so well, so maybe we'll tweak that a little bit. And I think that it kind of goes really hand in hand with, I would say, the general guidance that we also talk about when it's not necessarily about microservices, but just moving over to APIs, right? Like, just like, don't boil the ocean, start small, learn from these things, and then you can actually start rolling out things a little bit better.
I agree with what you said in theory and principle, right? Because it's obviously the correct thing. You try something, and if it doesn't work, you learn from it, and then you try again. Okay, here's the reality I've learned, though. With these kinds of transformation projects, you get a little bit of budget to take something that works and improve it. And if it doesn't work, you don't get any more budget, right? Because it didn't work. So
very true.
Right? So picking the thing that will be successful is also key to this, because you got to show value right away. And it's not easy.
Successful and impactful, right? It also needs to be something where the people who do control the budget say, oh yeah, we want more of that. If you do something that succeeds but is pointless, I don't think your budget will be extended, right? People say, yeah, that was probably interesting for you, but it's not really that meaningful for the company. Okay, so I think we went through a good set of things to keep in mind when you are maybe starting on your microservices journey, or you're a little further along and you think about what might happen. And is there anything you would like to add after these 5 truths, Ronnie, like your final insights into the microservices journeys that you have been a part of?
Sure. I think ultimately, no matter how you do this, whether you agree with the truths or not, I think this idea of an organization being introspective, examining itself, how it's structured, and improving it is always worthwhile, right? You're going to come out with some insights, some incremental improvements, no matter what. It's fantastic that we have a label for this way of optimizing what we're doing with implementation. And I just think it's an exciting time for the industry, right? To be working in this space, and that organizations care. And I'll tell you the truth, even the business side gets it. They see the value and they want more of it, right? So this is a good time to be working in this, and let's take all that goodwill and create real results as an industry. That's my hope.
Okay, I think these are great closing words. Thank you, Ronnie. Yes, I do agree. It's an exciting time to be in this space. It's changing very rapidly, and like you say, it's also, I think, more and more you get the feeling that you're not just doing tech stuff, you're actually doing stuff that matters for the whole organization, and I think that's almost the most rewarding aspect of it. Ronnie, thanks so much for joining and for sharing your insights. I hope that this is something that people can get something out of. And with that, we're done. Thanks, Ronnie.
Thank you.
And thanks, everybody, for watching. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. And until next time, see you.